The world outside the grimy window was a study in beige and brown, a relentless sun-scorched canvas that offered no comfort. Heat shimmered in waves off the cracked earth, making the distant, skeletal shapes of saguaros dance like phantoms. Dust, the fine, pervasive grit of the territories, coated everything, turning the green of the creosote bushes to a tired gray. It was a land that promised nothing but hardship and demanded everything in return. For Mary Ellen, it was the only direction left to run. The train was a beast of iron and steam, groaning its way across this desolation. It was not a grand passenger express from the east, with its velvet seats and polished brass, but a working train. A lifeline of steel stitching together lonely outposts and fledgling towns. Its cars were little more than wooden boxes on wheels, smelling of coal smoke, sweat, and cheap tobacco. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was a monotonous heartbeat, counting down the seconds of her fragile, stolen freedom. She stood on the narrow platform of the dusty way station, a place that was less a town and more a temporary wound on the face of the prairie. Her hands, raw and chapped, clutched a small, cloth satchel that held every worldly possession she now owned. She was a slip of a thing, lost inside a simple calico dress that, like her, had seen better days. Her hair, the color of autumn hay, was bundled imperfectly under a plain bonnet, with stray strands clinging to her damp neck. Her face was pale, her blue eyes wide and haunted, darting from the impassive sky to the few rough-looking men who loitered near the station house, their gazes lingering on her with a casual, assessing curiosity that made her skin crawl. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing whisper. The man she was fleeing, Mr. Abernathy, had a face like a clenched fist and hands that were cold and heavy. The memory of his thin, wet smile as her father signed the papers was a brand on her mind. He was a man of means and influence, a man who saw her as another acquisition, a pretty piece of property to be broken in. The thought of his possession, of the life that awaited her, had been a suffocating weight. And in the dead of night, with a desperation that felt like the last flicker of a dying candle, she had fled. The train's whistle blew a long, mournful cry, a sound that was both a summons and a warning. It was time. Taking a shallow, shuddering breath, Mary Ellen forced her trembling legs to move. She climbed the steep iron steps into the passenger car, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The air inside was thick and stagnant, a cocktail of stale air and human grime. The car was full, but not with the families and traveling merchants she might have hoped for. It was a rolling diorama of the West's hard men, prospectors with dust in their beards and a feverish glint in their eyes, ranch hands whose faces were sun-cured leather, gamblers with watchful, hooded gazes, and a few men whose professions were best left unspoken. They were silent for the most part, a collection of solitary beings thrown together by circumstance, each wrapped in his own thoughts. But as she stepped inside, a dozen pairs of eyes lifted, and a low, appreciative murmur rippled through the car. She felt their collective gaze like a physical touch, heavy and unwelcome. It stripped away her anonymity, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable, a lone lamb in a pen of quiet wolves. Her instinct screamed at her to retreat, to flee back into the open, but the whistle shrieked again, and with a violent lurch, the train began to move. She was trapped. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She couldn't stand here in the aisle, a spectacle for their amusement. She had to find a seat, a corner, any small space where she could fold into herself and become invisible. Her eyes scanned the crowded benches. Men sat sprawled, their legs taking up more than their share of space, their expressions ranging from blank indifference to veiled interest. There was no welcome here, no kindness to be found in these hard faces. Her gaze traveled the length of the car, past the rows of worn, wooden benches, past the grime-streaked windows, To the very last seat in the far back corner, a man sat there alone, a dark shape against the glaring light of the rear window. He was large, his shoulders broad enough to block out the view behind him. He wore a long, dusty duster that had seen miles of hard travel, and a dark, wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, casting his entire face in shadow. He was utterly still, a mountain of quietude in the gently swaying car. Seemingly oblivious to her or anyone else, he did not look up, he did not stir. To the other men, he seemed to be an object of deference. The space around him was respected, an invisible boundary that no one else dared to cross. This, more than anything, drew her to him, while the others watched her with open curiosity. This man offered the sanctuary of his indifference. He was her only hope of finding a place to hide. With her head down and her arms wrapped tightly around her satchel, Mary Ellen began the long walk down the aisle. Each step was an ordeal. The floorboards creaked under her worn-out shoes. The train swayed, and she had to reach out a hand to steady herself against the back of a bench, her fingers brushing against the coarse fabric of a stranger's sleeve. The man grunted but didn't move. She could feel the eyes following her, tracing her progress. She kept her own fixed on the floor, on the dark, still figure at the end of the car. As she drew closer, she could make out more details. His boots were scuffed and caked with the dust of a dozen territories, but the leather was well cared for. His hands rested on his knees, large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were the hands of a man who worked, who fought, who held the reins of a horse and perhaps the handle of a gun with equal familiarity. A worn gun belt was slung low on his hips, the holster tied down against his thigh, the wooden grip of a Colt Peacemaker polished smooth by use. He was not a man to be trifled with. He was, she realized with a fresh wave of fear, more dangerous than any of them. But his danger was contained, a coiled thing kept in check by a powerful will, while the danger from the other men felt loose and unpredictable. She finally reached the back of the car and stood, wavering, beside his bench. The seat next to him was empty. He still hadn't moved. The brim of his hat was so low she could only see the firm line of his jaw, covered in a dark stubble. He seemed to be asleep, or simply lost in a world of his own. She waited, her breath caught in her throat, hoping he might acknowledge her, might shift over to make it clear she could sit. He did not. The silence stretched, broken only by the click-clack of the wheels. The stares of the other men burned into her back. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there. Her desperation overrode her fear of him. She leaned forward, her voice so small and fragile it was nearly swallowed by the noise of the train. "Sir, excuse me, sir." There was no response. The shadow under the hat remained absolute. She tried again, a little louder, her voice cracking. "Please, may I?" She gestured feebly at the empty space beside him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a slowness that was unnervingly deliberate, his head tilted slightly, a fraction of an inch. It was the barest acknowledgement of her existence. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, but it was enough, taking it as permission. She sank onto the hard wooden bench, pulling her satchel onto her lap like a shield. She sat on the very edge of the seat, her body angled away from him, trying to make herself as small as possible. The proximity to him was overwhelming. He smelled of trail dust, leather, and something else, something clean and metallic, like cold water from a deep well. He was a wall of solid presence beside her. Now that she was sitting, the other men in the car seemed to lose interest, their gazes drifting back to the passing landscape or the dog-eared cards in their hands. The man's silent, intimidating aura had extended to her, a borrowed cloak of protection she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. They rode in silence for what felt like an eternity. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The light inside the car grew dim, and shadows lengthened, turning the faces of the other passengers into indistinct masks. Mary Ellen's fear, which had receded to a dull ache, began to sharpen again with the coming of the dark. Darkness was when Mr. Abernathy would have come to her. Darkness was when nightmares walked. Her hands began to tremble again, a tremor that started in her fingers and threatened to consume her whole body. She pressed her lips together to keep her teeth from chattering. She was so alone, so terrified. She had escaped one cage only to find herself in another, a rolling box filled with silent, hard-eyed men, hurtling through a wilderness that would swallow her whole without a trace. She chanced to glance at the man beside her. He hadn't moved a muscle. He was like a statue carved from granite and shadow. Who was he? A lawman, an outlaw, a rancher? His name was Luke Hart, though she had no way of knowing it. She could not know that the stillness he possessed was born from a past so steeped in violence that quiet was the only peace he ever knew. She could not see the ghosts that flickered behind his unseen eyes, or know that his silence was a dam holding back a river of bloody memories. She saw only a formidable, unreadable stranger. A wave of utter despair washed over her. She couldn't do this. She wasn't strong enough. She was a frightened girl who knew nothing of this world. The tears she had held back for so long finally began to well in her eyes, hot and stinging. A single sob escaped her throat, a tiny, choked sound. It was enough. The man's head turned fully toward her. In the dim light, she still couldn't see his eyes, but she felt their weight, their focus. The intensity of his unseen gaze was more unnerving than if he had shouted at her. The fear became a living thing inside her, a wild bird beating its wings against her ribs. Words tumbled from her lips before she could stop them, a desperate, breathless whisper. "I'm scared." It was a confession, a plea, an admission of her own pathetic weakness. She expected him to ignore her, or to grunt in annoyance, or worse, to laugh. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the dismissal. He did none of those things. For a long moment, he was silent. Then she heard a soft rustle of heavy fabric. She opened her eyes. He had shifted on the bench, turning his body slightly toward her. With one of those large, scarred hands, he took the edge of his duster, the heavy oilskin coat, and lifted the flap. He held it open, creating a dark, sheltered space against his side. It was not an invitation offered with warmth. There was no gentleness in the gesture. It was a simple, practical, and unspoken command, an offer of concealment. Hide here. Be quiet. She stared at the dark opening, then up at the shadowed face. He said nothing. He simply waited, holding the coat open. For Mary Ellen. It was the first act of consideration, however gruff and impersonal, that she had received from anyone in days. It was a shield, a hiding place. Without a second thought, she surrendered to the instinct for preservation. She slid across the bench and huddled into the space he had made, pulling her knees up to her chest. He let the flap of the heavy coat fall, enclosing her in a world of near-total darkness. The world outside, the leering men and the terrifying, empty land, disappeared. She was cocooned in the scent of him, the faint warmth of his body seeping through his clothes. The heavy fabric of the duster rested on her head and shoulders like a weighted blanket. She could feel the solid muscle of his thigh against her side, feel the subtle shifts of his body with the movement of the train. He remained perfectly still, a living wall between her and all her fears. He had not offered a kind word, not a single syllable of comfort, but in his silence, and in this one simple act, he had answered her plea. He had let her hide, and in the dark, warm quiet beneath the cowboy's coat, Mary Ellen finally stopped shaking. Time dissolved in the warm, rhythmic darkness, tucked away under the heavy duster. Mary Ellen was adrift in a sea of sensations. The constant rocking sway of the train car was a rough lullaby. The clatter of the steel wheels on the track was a steady, metallic pulse. She could feel the hard muscle of the stranger's leg against her back, a solid, unyielding reality in her terrifyingly uncertain world. The air smelled of worn leather and dust. a scent that was strangely calming, a clean and honest smell of the earth that was nothing like the cloying, perfumed rot of Mr. Abernathy's parlor. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the frantic beating of her heart slowed to a bearable rhythm. She was hidden. She was, for a moment, safe. This fragile peace was shattered not by a sound, but by a change in motion. The rhythmic beat of the wheels began to slow, the clatter losing its urgency. A long, groaning squeal of brakes protesting against steel vibrated through the floorboards and up into her bones. The car jolted, then lurched, its momentum grudgingly bleeding away. They were stopping. A new kind of tension rippled through the man beside her. It wasn't a large movement, merely a subtle stiffening of the muscles she was pressed against, a sudden alertness in the body that had been so relaxed. It was the change in a sleeping wolf that has caught a scent on the wind, her own fear, which had been dozing, snapped awake, instantly alert and sharp-toothed. Why were they stopping? There was nothing outside but miles of sun-baked wasteland. She heard the heavy thud of boots landing on the wooden platform outside, followed by more, not the shuffling, weary steps of passengers, but the confident, heavy tread of men with a purpose. A low murmur of voices carried through the thin walls of the car, indistinct but edged with a harsh authority. Inside the car, the lazy drone of conversation and the rustle of a newspaper died. A heavy, expectant silence fell. The door at the front of the car was wrenched open with a crash that made Mary Ellen flinch violently, pressing herself deeper into her hiding place. The silence in the car was now absolute, thick and charged. 3 men stood silhouetted against the bright, dusty light of the doorway. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their presence. It was a cold draft that had nothing to do with the temperature. Luke's heart remained perfectly still, but she could feel the change in his breathing. It hadn't quickened. Instead, it had deepened, slowed, each breath drawn and released with an unnerving, deliberate control. He was a man preparing for something. The footsteps started down the aisle. They were slow, measured, the heels of their boots striking the wooden floor with a sound like a hangman testing a scaffold. One set of steps, heavier than the others, led the way. Mary Ellen's entire world shrank to the sounds from beyond her dark curtain, the creak of the floorboards, the soft scrape of a boot, the almost inaudible rustle of clothing as the other passengers craned their necks to see. The footsteps paused. A voice, low and gravelly, cut through the quiet. "Evening." It was a courtesy spoken without a trace of politeness. A nervous mumble answered him. The footsteps resumed their slow, predatory march. Creak, creak, pause. The man was looking at each passenger, his gaze a physical weight that Mary Ellen could feel even from her hiding spot. She imagined a pair of cold, assessing eyes sweeping over the rows, dissecting faces, searching for her. A tremor started in her hands, and she balled them into fists, digging her nails into her palms to keep it from spreading. The steps were closer now, so close she could smell the sour odor of cheap whiskey and unwashed linen. They stopped directly beside their bench. Mary Ellen's breath hitched in her throat. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. This was it. He was here. She was trapped in this dark, suffocating space. A mouse hiding from a hawk that had just landed on its branch. "Well now," the gravelly voice said, so close it seemed to be speaking directly into her ear. "That's a mighty big coat for a warm evening, friend." Luke did not respond. The silence that followed was a living entity, coiling and tightening in the small space between the 2 men. Mary Ellen could feel Luke's stillness, could feel the sheer, immovable weight of his silence. It wasn't a passive quiet. It was an act of defiance, a wall of granite. "I asked you a question," the voice grated, losing its feigned civility. "What you got under there something you don't want folks to see?" She felt, more than saw, Luke begin to move, It was not the sudden, jerky motion of a startled man, but the slow, fluid unfolding of something immensely powerful. He shifted his weight, and his head, which had been angled down, slowly lifted. The flap of the duster moved slightly, and, for a heart-stopping second, a sliver of dim light cut into her darkness. She saw a pair of dusty boots, a stained trouser leg, and the glint of a silver buckle. Then the gap closed as Luke leaned forward just enough to block the view. "I'd be obliged if you'd move that coat." The man, whose name was Silas, insisted. His voice held the easy confidence of a man used to being obeyed, a man who carried a heavy pistol on his hip and knew how to use it. Luke Hart still did not speak. He simply finished lifting his head, letting the full force of his presence settle on the man standing before him, hidden in the darkness. Mary Ellen couldn't see his face, couldn't see the expression in his eyes, but she felt the effect of it. The air outside her sanctuary grew thick and cold. Silas, who had been leaning forward aggressively, seemed to go very still. The palpable sense of menace that had been flowing from him suddenly faltered, like a wave breaking against a cliff. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats, then 5, then 10. It was a silent battle of wills, fought with nothing more than posture and proximity. Silas was a predator, a wolf who hunted the weak for his master, but he had just cornered something that was not prey. The man sitting on the bench was a grizzly bear. Woken from a slumber, it had no desire to leave, and even a wolf knows not to provoke a grizzly. A nervous cough came from one of the other thugs standing a few feet behind Silas. The spell was weakening. Silas had to either act or retreat, and his moment for easy action had passed. He had been challenged and silently defeated. He let out a low, frustrated sound, a growl of thwarted authority. He had no real cause to force the issue. Not without drawing attention he didn't want a girl. His employer had said, small, blonde, scared. This silent giant was none of those things. It wasn't worth the risk. "Have it your way," Silas finally muttered, the words thick with resentment. He took a single step back. Mary Ellen felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made her weep. He was leaving. They were safe. It was in that exact moment, the instant the tension had begun to recede, that a new sound cut through the air, a triumphant shout from outside the train. "Silas, over here I found her track. She got on this car for sure." The voice was young, eager, and utterly damning. It was like a judge's gavel falling. The fragile bubble of their safety burst. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. Silas's hesitation vanished, replaced by a renewed, vicious certainty. "Well, I'll be," he snarled, his attention snapping back to the silent man on the bench. "So that's how it is." Before Silas or his men could take another step, Luke exploded into motion. There was no thought, no hesitation, just pure, primal action. One of his large hands shot out and clamped around Mary Ellen's wrist, his grip like a manacle of iron. In the same fluid movement, he was on his feet, pulling her up and out from under the coat. The sudden transition from darkness to the dim, chaotic light of the car was blinding. Mary Ellen stumbled, her legs numb and clumsy. The faces of the other passengers were a blur of shock and confusion. Silas and his men were lunging toward them, their expressions twisted in masks of fury. Luke didn't even glance at them. He was already moving, dragging her with him. He didn't head for the door where the men stood, nor for the one they had entered. He turned the other way, toward the rear of the car. "Get her!" Silas roared. The passengers scattered, some diving for the floor, others pressing themselves against the windows. The narrow aisle was a sudden pandemonium of shouting men and flying limbs. Luke was a force of nature, a battering ram of muscle and determination. He shoved a smaller man aside without breaking stride, his focus absolute. Mary Ellen could do nothing but try to keep her feet under her. His grip on her wrist was unbreakable, pulling her along in his powerful wake. Her small satchel was still clutched in her other hand. They reached the back platform of the car, a small, open space with a simple chain guard. The train was picking up speed now, the station already beginning to slide away behind them. Below them, the dry, rock-strewn ground was a blur of motion. One of Silas's men, a burly man with a thick neck, managed to catch up, his hand grabbing for Luke's shoulder. Luke didn't turn. He swung his free arm back in a brutal, efficient arc, his elbow connecting with the man's face with a sickening crunch. The man staggered back, blood pouring from his nose, and collapsed into a heap in the doorway. Luke didn't pause. He reached the edge of the platform, looked down at the rushing ground for a fraction of a second, then looked at Mary Ellen. In the fading twilight, she finally saw his eyes. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths, she saw no fear, only a cold, hard resolve. He gave her wrist a sharp tug. "Jump!" It wasn't a request. It was a command that expected absolute obedience. For a wild second, she froze, her mind screaming at the insanity of it. The ground was a moving tapestry of gravel and thorns. To jump was suicide. But to stay was a certainty far worse than death. To stay was to be caught, to be dragged back to Mr. Abernathy, to a life of quiet, soul-crushing violation. She looked from the terrifying ground back to the man's unyielding eyes. In that instant, she made her choice. She chose the terrifying unknown with this silent, violent stranger over the certain horror she was fleeing. She tightened her grip on her satchel and nodded. He didn't wait for another sign. He turned, pulling her with him, and launched them both off the side of the moving train and into the empty air. The world came back in a rush of pain and noise. Mary Ellen hit the ground with a force that drove the air from her lungs in a silent gasp. Gravel and sharp stones tore at her palms and the thin fabric over her knees. For a disoriented moment, all she knew was the rough, spinning earth, the taste of dust in her mouth, and a sharp, ringing pain in her shoulder. The thunderous clatter of the train was already receding, a dying beast abandoning them in the wilderness. Before she could even process the fall, the iron grip was back on her wrist, hauling her to her feet. She staggered, her head swimming, a cry of pain catching in her throat. Luke Hart was already moving, pulling her into a stumbling run. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. The angry shouts from the train, growing fainter but no less menacing, were all the explanation necessary. They were running, not on a path or a road, but across the raw, untamed land itself. The ground was a treacherous thing, a mix of loose dirt that slid under her worn shoes and jagged rocks that threatened to turn an ankle with every step. Her lungs burned. Desperate for the air she couldn't seem to draw in fast enough. Her side was a stitch of pure agony. Luke moved with a long, ground-eating stride that she struggled to match. He wasn't just running. He was navigating. His head was up, his unseen eyes scanning the landscape ahead, reading its creases and folds like a map he knew by heart. He seemed to draw strength from the harshness of the land, while it did nothing but sap hers away. He pulled her relentlessly onward, his grip a constant, painful reminder that to stop, to even falter, was not an option. The last rays of the sun bled across the horizon, setting the western sky ablaze in brutal shades of orange, crimson, and violet. The light was beautiful, but it offered no warmth, only a stark, unforgiving illumination that stretched their shadows long and hunted behind them. The pursuers would be coming. Silas and his men would have jumped or forced the train to a halt. They would be mounted soon, if they weren't already. On horseback, they would run them to ground in this open country before the last light failed. As if sensing her panicked thoughts, Luke changed direction abruptly, veering toward a dark gash in the earth, a deep arroyo carved by flash floods that likely hadn't seen water in a decade. He half slid, half ran down the steep, crumbling bank, pulling her along with him. They landed in a shower of pebbles and dust on the sandy floor of the dry wash. Down here, the world was different. The searing light of the sunset was cut off, and the air was still and close. The walls of the arroyo rose 10 feet on either side, a claustrophobic corridor of baked earth and stone. It offered cover, hiding them from the open plain, but it felt like a trap. The only way was forward or back. Luke chose forward, his pace not slackening. The sand was deep, and her feet sank with every agonizing step, her shoes filling with grit. Twice she stumbled, her knees buckling from sheer exhaustion. But his grip was a vice, holding her up, pulling her onward. He didn't look back at her. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, on the fading light, on the sounds that might carry in the still air. He was like a machine built for survival. Every movement was efficient, stripped of anything unnecessary. He ran with a slight crouch, his body a coiled spring of readiness. He was a creature of this wilderness, and for the first time, a sliver of something other than terror worked its way into Mary Ellen's heart. He was dangerous. Yes, a man of violence and silence. But that danger was now her only shield. She was bound to this force of nature, and her survival depended entirely on his. After what felt like a mile, he found what he was looking for, a place where the arroyo wall had collapsed, creating a rough ramp leading back to the surface. He scrambled up it, his boots finding purchase where Mary Ellen could see none. He hauled her up the last few feet, and they emerged, gasping, back onto the plain. The landscape had changed. They were now in a sprawling, nightmarish garden of cacti. Saguaro stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels against the dying light. Chola, fuzzy and deceptively soft-looking, waited to embed 1,000 needle-like spines into unwary flesh. Prickly pear grew in dense, tangled clumps, their flat pads studded with thorns. Luke plunged into it without hesitation, weaving a path through the dangerous flora with an instinct that was baffling. He seemed to know the precise clearance he needed, the exact placement for each footfall. Mary Ellen was not so fortunate. The hem of her dress caught on a low-growing cactus, and with a sharp rip, the fabric tore. A cluster of fine, hair-like needles embedded themselves in her calf, stinging like 100 tiny wasps. She bit down hard on her lip to stifle a cry, the coppery taste of her own blood flooding her mouth. She would not cry out. She would not complain. This man was her only chance, and he had no time for weakness. To be a burden was to be left behind, and to be left behind in this wasteland, with Silas on her trail, was a fate she refused to contemplate. So she ran on, the needles in her leg a fiery reminder of every jarring step. The last sliver of the sun vanished below the horizon, and the swift desert twilight began to settle, blurring the edges of the world into shades of purple and gray. The heat radiating from the dark stones around them was a palpable presence. They were running out of time. She could hear it in the harsh, rasping sound of her own breathing. Luke finally slowed. Pulling her behind a large outcrop of dark red rock, he crouched, pulling her down with him, his hand leaving her wrist for the first time and pressing firmly on her shoulder to keep her still. For a long moment, he was motionless, a predator testing the wind. He listened, his head cocked, his whole body a study in concentration. Far off, in the direction they had come from, a sound drifted on the evening breeze. A dog barking no, a man shouting, his voice faint and distorted by the distance. They were being tracked. Luke's hand tightened on her shoulder. Then he rose. He pointed to a dense patch of dry brush and tumbleweeds gathered by the wind against a low ridge. "Stay," he commanded. It was the first word he had spoken to her. His voice was a low, rough baritone, like rocks grinding together. It wasn't unkind, but it held no room for argument. She huddled behind the rock, her body screaming with 1,000 different aches, and watched him. He moved to the brush pile with a swift, silent purpose. From a pouch on his belt, he took out a small piece of flint and a steel striker. Kneeling, he shredded a piece of dry inner bark from a dead greasewood branch, creating a small, fluffy pile of tinder. He worked with a speed and economy of motion that was mesmerizing. There was no wasted effort, no hesitation. He struck the steel against the flint. A shower of orange sparks fell into the tinder. Nothing. He struck it again. A tiny ember glowed, then died. On the third strike, a spark caught. A thin curl of smoke rose, and a small, hungry flame licked at the tinder. Luke gently blew on it, coaxing it, feeding it tiny, dry twigs until it grew into a confident little fire. Then, he pushed the whole burning mass into the heart of the tumbleweed pile. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The dry, resinous plants erupted in a whoosh of flame. A great billow of thick, white smoke mushroomed into the darkening sky, acrid and choking. The fire crackled and roared, consuming the brush with a ferocious appetite, casting a flickering, demonic light on the surrounding rocks. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, seemed to be drawn to the blaze, and it caught the massive column of smoke and began to push it eastward, away from them, creating a perfect screen. Luke was already back at her side, his hand clamping onto her wrist once more. "Now," he growled, and pulled her into a run again, this time at an angle, heading north, away from the deceptive smoke signal. It was a brilliant, desperate move. To their pursuers, the smoke would indicate their location, a beacon in the night. It would draw them in, while they themselves fled in the opposite direction under the cover of the confusion and the encroaching darkness. It was the move of a hunter, a man who knew not only how to track, but how to lay a false trail. The darkness was a blessing and a curse. It hid them, but it also hid the dangers underfoot. The pace was punishing. Mary Ellen's vision swam. The world was a dizzying blur of dark shapes and looming shadows. She was running on nothing now. No strength, no will. Only the forward momentum provided by the man whose hand was locked around her own. Her foot caught on a root or a rock, she didn't know which, and this time, his grip couldn't save her. She went down hard, sprawling in the dirt, the impact knocking the wind from her again. Her satchel flew from her grasp. She lay there, gasping, every muscle in her body trembling with exhaustion. "This is it," she thought. "I can't get up. I can't go another step." Tears of frustration and pain burned at the back of her eyes. Luke stopped, turning back to loom over her in the darkness. She couldn't see his face, only his immense silhouette against the faint starlight. She expected him to curse her, to abandon her. Instead, he simply bent down, his powerful hands finding her arms, and lifted her back to her feet as if she weighed nothing. He picked up her satchel and pressed it back into her hand. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a second, letting her find her balance, his hands still gripping her arms. She looked up at the place where his face would be. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. He didn't answer. He simply let go of her arms, took her wrist again, and started walking. His pace slower now, more measured. He was no longer running, but he was not stopping. He was adapting to her weakness, conserving what little strength she had left. They walked on in silence, a pair of ghosts moving through the vast, indifferent darkness of the desert night. The only sounds were the scuff of their boots on the sandy soil, the chirping of crickets, and the distant, lonely howl of a coyote. Luke held her hand, not just pulling her, but guiding her now, his grip a steady, silent presence that kept her from falling, that kept her moving forward, one agonizing step at a time into the deep, dark unknown. How long they walked, Mary Ellen could not say. Time had lost all meaning, replaced by a simple, brutal rhythm: left foot, right foot, breathe. The moon rose, a pale, indifferent witness in a sky littered with cold, diamond-sharp stars. The world was a vast, silent cathedral of rock and shadow. Luke's hand on her wrist was the only anchor she had, the one solid point in a universe of pain and exhaustion. He led her on, his steps as sure and steady in the darkness as they had been in the light. He was no longer pulling her, but supporting her, his grip a living brace against the fatigue that was trying to drag her down into the dirt. Just when she thought her legs would finally give out, that she would simply fold into herself and be swallowed by the night, she felt a change in the terrain. The ground began to slope gently downward, the air grew cooler, and she could smell the faint, clean scent of damp earth and cottonwood trees, the smell of water. The darkness began to soften at the edges, the impenetrable black giving way to a deep, bruised purple. Dawn was coming. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, it revealed their surroundings. They were standing at the mouth of a small, hidden valley. It was a pocket of impossible life carved out of the surrounding desolation, fed by a narrow creek that glittered like a silver thread in the nascent light. Sycamores and cottonwoods lined its banks, their leaves whispering in the cool morning breeze. Nestled in the heart of this sanctuary was a small homestead. It was not a grand ranch, but a simple, solitary outpost against the wilderness. A sturdy cabin built of thick, dark logs sat under the protective arm of a massive oak. A small, well-kept barn stood beside it, connected by a corral fashioned from weathered timber. A few chickens were beginning to stir and cluck in a small coop, and a lone horse stood sleeping in the corral. Its head hung low. The place was utterly isolated, a world unto itself. It was a fortress of solitude. This was his home. As they walked the last 100 yards, the exhaustion that had been Mary Ellen's constant companion was joined by a new, sharp anxiety. What was this place? Who was this man who lived like a hermit in the middle of nowhere? She had fled one kind of trap. Was she now walking willingly into another? But a glance at the cabin, with its plume of lazy smoke already rising from the stone chimney, did not suggest a prison. It suggested a home. Before they reached the porch, the cabin door creaked open. A small figure appeared, silhouetted against the warm, yellow lamplight from within. It was a boy, no older than 7, with a riot of dark, sleep-tousled hair and wearing a simple homespun shirt that was too big for him. He stood blinking in the twilight, his expression one of sleepy confusion, until he saw the tall figure of Luke. The boy's face broke into a grin of pure, unadulterated joy. "Luke!" he shouted, his voice high and clear in the morning quiet. He ran from the porch, his bare feet flying across the dusty ground, and launched himself not at Luke's legs, but at the hand that wasn't holding Mary Ellen's. Luke stopped, and his large, calloused hand enveloped the boy's small one. He didn't smile, not in the way other men smiled, but the hard lines of his face seemed to soften, the coldness in his unseen eyes momentarily thawing. He squeezed the boy's hand gently. "Mornin', Ben," he said, his voice the same low rumble she had heard in the wilderness. The boy, Ben, finally seemed to notice her. He stopped his excited bouncing and stared, his head cocked to one side like a curious sparrow. His eyes, large and brown, were wide with unconcealed wonder. He looked at her torn dress, her scratched face, and the way Luke was still holding her wrist. Not as a prisoner, but as a man leading a foundling. He looked at her with the frank, guileless curiosity of a child, free of judgment or suspicion. Luke released her wrist, the absence of his touch leaving her feeling strangely unsteady. He placed his hand on Ben's shoulder. "Ben, this is Mary Ellen. She'll be staying with us for a spell." It was a statement of fact, an edict delivered in his quiet, absolute way. Ben didn't question it. He simply gave her a small, shy smile and a little wave. "Hello," he said. The simple, innocent greeting was so unexpected, so normal in a world that had become a waking nightmare, that it almost broke her. She managed a weak, trembling smile in return. "Hello, Ben." Luke guided them inside. The cabin was a single large room, but it was clean and orderly. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and bacon. A stone fireplace, large enough to stand in, dominated one wall. In the center of the room sat a rough-hewn wooden table with 2 chairs. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner, a kettle already beginning to steam on its surface. Along the far wall were two simple bunks, one neatly made, the other a tangle of blankets from which Ben had clearly just emerged. A third, smaller cot was folded against the wall. It was a man's world, Spartan and functional, but it was not a place of squalor. The floor was swept clean. A few tin plates and cups were stacked neatly by a wash basin, and a worn but clean rag rug lay before the hearth. It was a home cared for. Luke gestured toward the basin on a dry sink. "Water's fresh." He then pointed to the folded cot. "You can take that," having provided for her immediate needs. He turned his attention to the stove, pouring coffee into a tin mug. He offered no further explanation. He asked no questions. He did not ask her where she had come from, or why she was running, or how she had ended up on that train. His silence was a gift, a grant of privacy that was more precious to her than any words of comfort could ever be. He was giving her space to breathe. Ben, however, was not a creature of silence. He pulled one of the chairs out from the table for her. "You can sit," he offered. "Are you hungry? Luke's making bacon. He makes the best bacon." Mary Ellen sank into the chair, her body protesting with a chorus of deep, aching pains. She nodded, unable to find her voice. Ben seemed to understand. He simply pulled up the other chair and sat opposite her, watching her with his big, serious eyes. A silent, 4-foot-tall guardian. Luke worked at the stove with the same quiet efficiency she had seen when he'd built the fire. He moved with a familiar grace in the small space, slicing bacon from a slab, cracking eggs into a hot skillet. He placed a plate of hot food in front of her and Ben, along with a mug of steaming coffee for her. He ate standing, leaning against the mantel of the fireplace, his gaze distant, as if he were already planning the day's chores or watching the horizon for threats. The food tasted like salvation. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, the warmth spreading through her chilled, exhausted body. After they had finished, Ben cleared the plates, taking them to the wash basin. An awkward silence settled over the room. Mary Ellen knew she should say something, should thank this man, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? "Thank you for saving me from my pursuers. Thank you for jumping off a moving train. Thank you for bringing me to your home instead of leaving me to die in the desert." The gratitude she felt was too immense, too profound to be contained in a few simple words. Instead, she stood up, her muscles screaming in protest, and walked to the wash basin. She gently took the dishcloth from Ben's hands. "I can do that," she said softly. And so she began to work. It was an instinct, a deep-seated need to do something, to be useful, to repay in some small way the sanctuary she had been given. She washed the dishes, her hands finding a familiar comfort in the hot, soapy water. She tidied the small kitchen area, putting things away, wiping down the counters. She took the broom from its hook by the door and swept the floor, her movements slow and stiff, but deliberate. Luke watched her for a moment from his place by the fire, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat, which he had yet to remove. He said nothing. He simply finished his coffee, set the mug down, and went outside. A few moments later, she heard the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. She worked all morning. She found a pile of mending in a basket, a shirt of Luke's with a torn sleeve, a pair of Ben's trousers with a hole in the knee. She found a small sewing kit and sat in the chair by the window, the needle and thread moving in her bruised and scraped fingers. Each stitch was a tiny act of reclamation, a way of imposing order on a world that had descended into chaos. Ben was her constant companion. He brought her a cup of water. He showed her a small horse he had carved from a piece of pine wood. He sat on the floor beside her chair, chattering away about the chickens, the horse in the corral whose name was Dusty, and a coyote he had heard the night before. He didn't ask her any questions about herself. He simply included her in his world, his innocent, open-hearted acceptance, a healing balm on her wounded spirit. He treated her as if her sudden appearance were the most natural thing in the world, as if she had always been sitting in that chair, mending his trousers. In the afternoon, utterly spent, she lay down on the cot Luke had indicated. She was asleep before her head even settled on the thin pillow. She slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the first true rest she had known in what felt like an eternity. When she woke, the cabin was filled with the long, golden light of late afternoon. The air was quiet. From outside, she could hear the gentle nicker of a horse and the distant sound of Luke's hammering. She sat up, feeling stiff and sore, but profoundly different. The terror that had been her constant companion for days had receded. It was still there, a dark shape lurking in the corners of her mind, but it no longer had its claws in her heart. She went to the door and looked out. The valley was bathed in a warm, peaceful light. Luke was mending a section of the corral fence, his broad back to her, the steady rise and fall of his hammer a rhythmic, reassuring sound. Ben was sitting on the top rail of the fence, watching him, his small legs dangling. It was a scene of perfect, ordinary peace. It was a life, for a day. She had been allowed to step into it, to find a moment's respite. She knew it couldn't last. She knew that Silas and his men were still out there, somewhere beyond the sheltering walls of this valley. The peace was fragile, the safety temporary. But as she stood in the doorway, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, it was enough. For the first time in a long time, Mary Ellen allowed herself to hope. The day bled away into a soft, quiet evening. A simple supper of stew and fresh baked bread passed in the same comfortable quiet that had settled over the small cabin. Ben, his small body heavy with sleep, had recited a simple prayer and then climbed into his bunk, pulling the covers up to his chin. Within minutes, the soft, even sound of his breathing filled the room, a gentle rhythm of peace. The world outside the cabin's sturdy walls fell silent, save for the lonely chirp of a cricket and the whisper of the night breeze through the eaves. The room was bathed in the warm, gentle glow of a single kerosene lamp on the table, its light turning the rough-hewn log walls to a rich, honeyed gold. Embers glowed a deep, pulsating red in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small space feel both intimate and ancient. It was a profound and peaceful quiet, a stark contrast to the screaming terror of the past few days. For Mary Ellen, it was a silence that felt less like an absence of noise and more like a presence, a living thing that was slowly, gently, bandaging the raw wounds on her soul. Luke had not spoken more than a handful of words to her all day, yet she had not felt ignored. His silence was a language all its own. It had spoken to her when he'd left a clean, folded blanket on her cot while she slept. It had spoken when he'd wordlessly refilled her water cup at supper. It was a silence of consideration, of respect. It built no walls, but instead, it seemed to clear a space, leaving room for her to simply be. She gathered the few dishes from the table and carried them to the wash basin. The familiar, domestic task was a comfort, a small piece of her old life that she could hold on to in this new, bewildering one. She poured hot water from the heavy kettle on the stove, the steam rising to mist her face. As she worked, her hands moving through the warm, soapy water, the quiet of the cabin seemed to deepen, to press in on her. It was in this quiet that the memories began to surface, not as the sharp, terrifying flashes of her flight, but as a slow, heavy tide of sorrow. The safety of these walls, the unexpected kindness of this silent man, had lowered her defenses, and the story she had held clenched deep inside her began to unspool. She hadn't intended to speak. The words simply came, unbidden. Her voice so low it was barely more than a breath of sound, a whisper meant only for herself that happened to find its way into the quiet room. "My father was a good man. Once," she began, her gaze fixed on the plate she was washing, her knuckles white where she gripped its edge. "Before the drought, before my mother passed, the world just wore him down, made him small. Luke was sitting at the table, cleaning a piece of harness leather with a soft, oiled cloth. At the sound of her voice, his hand stilled. He did not look at her, but she felt the shift in his attention, the sudden, absolute focus of his entire being. He was listening, encouraged by his silence. She continued, the words spilling out now, soft and hesitant. He owned a small farm, back in Ohio. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Then the crops failed. 1 year, then 2. The bank took the livestock, then the land. We lost everything. He started drinking. He changed. She paused, scrubbing at a spot on the plate that was already clean. The memories were a thick, bitter paste in her throat. There was a man, a Mr. Abernathy. He came through our town, buying up all the failed farms for pennies on the dollar. He was a rich man, powerful. Everyone was afraid of him. He had a face like a shut ledger book, and eyes that never seemed to blink. She could see him now, in her mind's eye, a man built of sharp angles and cold calculation, his clothes always immaculate, his hands soft and pale, hands that had never known a day of honest labor. He came to our house. He spoke to my father for a long time. I could hear their voices through the door. My father's, pleading, Mr. Abernathy's, low and smooth and hard, like stones rubbing together. When he left, my father wouldn't look at me. He just sat at the table with a bottle and stared at the wall. The next day, he told me I was to be married. She set the plate down and picked up another, her movements jerky. Mr. Abernathy was older, much older than my father. He had buried 2 wives already. People whispered about it, about how they had just withered. He wanted a young wife, a son. My father had sold his last possession to clear his debts. He had sold me. The ugliest word, sold, hung in the air between them, stark and brutal. She finally risked a glance at Luke. He had set the harness aside and risen from the table. He walked not towards her, but to the stack of clean, wet dishes she had set aside. He picked up a clean, dry cloth and, without a word, began to dry the plate she had just washed. His action was so simple, so unexpected, it nearly brought her to tears. He hadn't flinched at her words. He hadn't offered pity or judgment. He had simply joined her in her task, standing beside her, a large, solid presence in the lamplight. He was sharing the burden of the moment, not with words, but with work. She turned back to the basin, her vision blurring slightly. The wedding was to be in a week, she continued, her voice stronger now, bolstered by his silent companionship. He gave me a new dress, silk. It felt like a shroud. He would visit in the evenings, and he would sit in our parlor and look at me. He never touched me, not really, but his eyes touched everything. He looked at me the same way he looked at a new horse he had bought, something to be broken, something that belonged to him completely. The night before the ceremony, I couldn't breathe. I felt like the walls were closing in. I just knew, that if I let him put his ring on my finger, something inside of me would die, the part of me that was still me. So I ran. She described the frantic, whispered packing of her small satchel, the few coins she had saved, the worn dress she chose over the silk one, and then she came to the secret. A Mr. Abernathy, he was not just a hard businessman. He was a cheat. He left his valise at our house one evening. My father was passed out from drink. I don't know why I did it. I just had a feeling. I opened it. Her hands trembled in the water. There were papers inside, ledgers. They showed how he was cheating his partners, how he had falsified deeds to steal land from poor families. Families like mine. It was all there, written in his own hand. Proof that could ruin him, send him to prison. She swallowed hard. I took one, just one page from the ledger, a page that detailed the transaction for the Miller farm, our neighbors. He had ruined them. I took the page and a small bag of coins he had left on the table as a down payment for me, and I fled. I knew he wouldn't just be coming after me because I was a runaway bride. He would be coming after me because I carried a secret that could destroy him. He would never stop hunting me. Her story was finished. The last whispered words faded into the quiet of the room. She had laid the whole, ugly truth of her life bare before this stranger. She stood, trembling slightly, her hands submerged in the now tepid water, waiting for his reaction, for his judgment. Luke finished drying the last plate. He stacked it carefully with the others. He folded the dishcloth and set it neatly on the edge of the dry sink. Then he turned to face her. In the soft lamplight, she could not see his eyes clearly under the brim of his hat, but she could feel their steady, unwavering gaze. He was silent for a long time. The only sounds, the hiss of the embers and the frantic pounding of her own heart. He did not say, "You were brave." He did not say, "You did the right thing." He did not say, "You'll be safe here." Words like that were easy, and they were often empty. Instead, he simply reached out, his large, scarred hand moving past her, and picked up the heavy kettle from the stove. He poured a stream of fresh, steaming water into her basin, warming the water she stood in. The gesture was so profound, so full of a deep and silent understanding, that it undid her completely. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. He hadn't offered words. He had offered a continuation of the moment, a simple, practical act of care. He had heard her story of cruelty and betrayal, and his response was to give her warm water for her tired hands. He said nothing. He simply stood there, his presence a shield, a silent testament that he had listened. He had heard, and he had not turned away. His quiet was not an absence of feeling, but a space that was filled with a powerful, unspoken empathy. He had ghosts of his own. She knew instinctively. He understood what it was to be hunted, to be haunted. His silence was not empty. It was a form of communion, a deep and resonant understanding that went far beyond the reach of mere words. And in that shared silence, as she finished the last of the dishes, Mary Ellen felt the first true flicker of safety she had known since she had run out into the cold Ohio night. The frantic, desperate rhythm of the escape gave way to a new, quieter cadence. The days in Luke Hart's hidden valley began to unfold, one much like the next, each marked by the rising and setting of the sun and the simple, grounding rituals of a life lived close to the earth. The world shrank to the protective walls of the canyon, and the terror that had been Mary Ellen's shadow began, for the first time, to recede. A routine, unspoken and unbidden, began to form, as natural as the flow of the creek at the bottom of the valley. She would wake in the pre-dawn chill to the smell of wood smoke and coffee. Luke would already be up, a silent silhouette moving about the cabin, his preparations for the day as quiet and efficient as all his other movements. She and Ben would feed the small flock of chickens, the boys' cheerful chatter a bright thread in the tapestry of the quiet morning. She learned the quirks of the old iron stove, how to bank the coals just right to keep a loaf of bread from burning, how to make a savory stew from dried beans, salted meat, and the few hardy vegetables that grew in the small, sun-drenched garden patch behind the cabin. Her body began to heal. The deep, angry scratches from her flight through the cactus field faded to thin, white lines. The bruises on her knees and shoulder melted away, their violent purples and blues softening to a faint yellow before disappearing entirely. The constant, trembling ache in her muscles was replaced by a different kind of weariness. At the end of the day, the good, honest fatigue that comes from meaningful work. She mended their clothes, her stitches growing stronger and more even. She scrubbed the cabin floor until the planks shone. She was not a guest, nor a prisoner, but a participant in this small, solitary world. Each task, no matter how humble, was an affirmation of her own survival, a reclaiming of herself. She began to notice the beauty of her cage. She saw the way the morning sun first struck the highest peak of the canyon rim, turning the rock to a brilliant, fiery orange. She learned to distinguish the sharp, clean scent of sage from the dusty perfume of the creosote bushes. She watched hawks ride the thermal currents high above, their wings spread wide against the impossibly blue sky. This valley, which had at first felt like the end of the world, was beginning to feel like a world of its own, a place of stark, fierce beauty that mirrored the man who had brought her here. One afternoon, while walking with Ben along the creek bed, her eyes caught a flash of defiant color against a backdrop of sun-bleached stone. It was a single, stubborn wildflower, an Indian paintbrush, its scarlet petals a slash of vibrant life against the hard, unforgiving rock from which it grew. It was beautiful in its resilience, a testament to the fact that life could find a way to bloom in the harshest of places. Ben, seeing where her gaze had settled, ran over and picked it for her with the thoughtless generosity of a child. "It's pretty," he said, holding it up to her. She took the flower, its stem fragile in her fingers. In its lonely strength, she saw a reflection of her own burgeoning hope. She carried it back to the cabin, the bright red a stark contrast to her plain, worn dress. She wanted, with a sudden, inexplicable urgency, to give it to Luke. It was a foolish impulse. What would a man like him, a man of iron and silence, do with a simple flower? He would likely see it as a useless, frivolous thing. Still, the feeling persisted. It was the only way she knew to say thank you for the sanctuary, for the unspoken kindnesses, for the life he had given back to her. That evening, after he came in from the corral, smelling of dust and horse, she found her moment. He was cleaning his pistol at the table, his movements precise and methodical. She walked past him, her heart thumping with a strange nervousness, and laid the single bright flower on the table beside his oilcloth. She didn't say a word, and neither did he. He didn't even look up. For a moment, she was certain she had made a mistake, that her small gesture had been clumsy and unwelcome. She turned away quickly, her cheeks burning, and busied herself at the stove. Later that night, after Ben was asleep and the cabin was sunk in its usual deep quiet, she sat on her cot, pretending to read a worn copy of an almanac by the faint lamplight. Luke was preparing to take a turn outside, a habit she'd noticed he had, a silent, solitary patrol of his domain before turning in for the night. He pulled on his heavy duster, the one she had hidden under. As he did, he paused at the table. He picked up the wildflower, which still lay where she had left it. She watched him from under her lashes, her own breathing seeming to stop. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the small, scarlet bloom resting in his large, scarred palm. He touched one of the petals with the tip of his finger, a surprisingly gentle gesture. Then, from an inner pocket of the duster, he produced a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover softened and darkened with age and use. He opened it carefully to a page near the middle and, with a delicate precision she would not have thought him capable of, he laid the flower flat between the pages and closed the book. He slipped it back into his pocket, settled his hat on his head, and walked out into the night, leaving her alone with the knowledge of his secret. He had kept her gift. He had pressed it into a book he carried close to his person, preserving it. The silent, private act was more eloquent than 1,000 words of thanks. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of the fragile, beautiful thing she had offered him. A conversation began between them then, a language composed entirely of these small, silent actions. It was a language of observation, of anticipation, of quiet care. A few days later, Mary Ellen found a spot a short walk from the cabin, a flat-topped boulder that overlooked the entire valley. It became her place to sit in the late afternoon, to feel the breeze and watch the shadows lengthen. But the rock, baked by the relentless sun, was uncomfortably hot. She had to shift constantly, unable to find a true moment of peace. The next day, when she went to her spot, she found a piece of thick, tanned sheepskin, soft and insulating. laid neatly over the surface of the rock, and beside it, tucked into the shade of a smaller stone, sat a tin cup filled with cool water from the well. No one had said a word. Ben had been with her the day before, but he hadn't mentioned it. Luke had been mending a bridle on the porch when she'd left the cabin. He had simply watched her go. Then, in the space between, he had observed her need and met it. He had taken the time to walk out there, to place the sheepskin in the cup of water, an act of pure, unheralded consideration. Their connection began to build, woven from these invisible threads. He noticed she struggled with the heavy axe when splitting kindling. The next morning, she found a smaller hand axe resting against the wood pile, its blade honed to a razor's edge, its handle sanded smooth to fit a smaller grip. She, in turn, noticed the way he always favored his left shoulder after a long day's work. She began heating a small salt poultice on the stove in the evenings and would leave it, wrapped in a cloth, on the table by his chair without a word. He would find it, and in the quiet of the evening, she would see him press the warm compress to his aching shoulder. She took over the mending completely, her needle and thread becoming instruments of a quiet devotion. She found a shirt of his that was so worn at the collar it was about to fray through. She painstakingly reinforced it from the inside with a piece of softer cloth, her tiny, even stitches nearly invisible. When he wore it the next time, she saw his hand go to the collar, his rough fingers tracing the line of her work, his expression thoughtful. He began leaving things for her, a bird's feather of an impossibly bright blue, laid on the windowsill, a handful of sweet, wild berries, left in a bowl on the table. Small, beautiful things he found on his rides through the valley, offerings left without ceremony. These small gifts, these acts of silent communication, became the pillars of her new reality. They were building a life together, not with promises or declarations, but with the steady, daily accumulation of small kindnesses. Theirs was a connection that was not spoken, but lived, a bond forged in the quiet spaces between the words that were never said. The peace was a fragile, beautiful thing, and like all beautiful things in that hard land, it was not meant to last. It was broken on a Tuesday afternoon, an afternoon so bright and ordinary that the violence of its end felt like a blasphemy. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue. A gentle breeze carried the scent of warm dust and dry grass. Mary Ellen was hanging laundered sheets on a line strung between the cabin and a tall oak, the white fabric billowing like the sails of a ship on a calm sea. Ben was on the porch, meticulously arranging a line of pebbles into a defensive wall for a fort made of twigs. It was a scene of such profound domestic tranquility that the memory of it would later seem like a dream. Luke was by the corral, re-shoeing his horse. Dusty, the rhythmic, metallic ring of his hammer against the anvil was the steady heartbeat of their afternoon. Suddenly, the hammering stopped. The silence that followed was abrupt and unnatural, a skipped beat that made the hairs on Mary Ellen's arms stand on end. She turned, a wooden pin still in her hand. Luke was standing perfectly still, his head lifted, his gaze fixed on the northern rim of the valley, a dark, unmoving statue. She followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze rising from the distant hills. Then she saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible plume of dust, rising against the blue sky. It was too small for a cattle drive, too steady for a dust devil. It was riders. A cold dread, a feeling she had almost forgotten, washed over her. She saw Luke drop the hammer in the horseshoe. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, all his languid grace gone, replaced by the lethal efficiency of a cornered predator. "Mary!" he called, his voice low but carrying with an urgency that turned her blood to ice. "Get Ben! Inside! Now!" She didn't question it. She snatched Ben from the porch, ignoring his startled cry of protest, and half-carried, half-dragged him into the cabin. "What is it, Mary? What's happening?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. "Just stay away from the windows, sweetheart," she said, her own voice strained and thin. She slammed the heavy wooden bar across the door, the sound echoing in the sudden, tomb-like quiet of the room. Outside, she heard Luke shout a single, sharp name, Raoul. A moment later, the side door of the small barn creaked open and an old man emerged. He was wiry and bent with age, his face a sun-cured roadmap of wrinkles, but he held a long-barreled shotgun in his gnarled hands with a familiar ease. He exchanged a few curt words with Luke, then moved to take up a position behind a water trough that offered a clear line of sight to the mouth of the valley. This was Raoul, the hired hand she had only seen from a distance, a man who, she now realized, was more than just a ranch worker. He was a sentry. Luke came inside, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He moved immediately to the large wooden chest that sat at the foot of his bunk. He lifted the lid, revealing not blankets, but an arsenal. He pulled out a Winchester rifle and a heavy Colt revolver, the twin of the one he wore on his hip. He checked the loads with swift, practiced movements. "They found us," Mary Ellen whispered, the words tasting like ash. He didn't answer, his focus absolute. He pushed the rifle into her hands. The weapon was shockingly heavy, its wood smooth, its steel cold and deadly. "You know how to use this?" She shook her head, her whole body trembling. "No." "You learn now," he said, his tone leaving no room for fear. He spent less than a minute showing her, his hands guiding hers, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "That's the sight. Pull the hammer, squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it, and don't shoot till you know what you're hittin'." He took the spare Colt for himself and moved to the window beside the door, peering through a small crack in the shutter. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The minutes crawled by, each one a lifetime of suffocating tension. Mary Ellen huddled with Ben in the far corner of the room, behind the stone hearth, her arms wrapped around the terrified, silent boy. She held the heavy rifle across her lap, its weight a terrible, alien presence. Then they heard it, the slow, deliberate clop of horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth. 3 riders emerged from the cottonwoods by the creek, their figures dark against the afternoon sun. They rode not with haste, but with the arrogant leisure of men who knew their quarry was trapped. As they drew closer, her heart seized. The man in the lead was Silas. His cruel, familiar face was set in a triumphant sneer. He reined in his horse 50 yards from the cabin. "Hard!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "I know you're in there, and I know you've got what belongs to Mr. Abernathy. Send the girl out, and we might just let you and the boy live." The only answer from the cabin was the metallic click of Luke cocking his revolver. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Have it your way." He raised his hand and dropped it. The world erupted in a cataclysm of noise. Gunshots cracked, sharp and deafening. A bullet slammed into the log wall beside the window, sending a shower of wooden splinters into the room. Mary Ellen screamed and pulled Ben closer, shielding his head with her body. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, was now a trap, a wooden box under siege. Luke and Raoul returned fire, their shots measured and deliberate. The attackers were using their horses for cover, firing from behind their saddles. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. A window pane shattered, spraying glass across the floor. Ben was sobbing now, his small body shaking uncontrollably. Luke was a rock in the storm. He moved between the 2 front windows, firing, reloading, his face a mask of cold fury. He was fighting with a ferocity that was terrifying to behold. A man defending his last patch of ground on earth. For 10 minutes, the firefight was a brutal stalemate. The thick log walls of the cabin provided good cover, and Luke and Raoul were skilled marksmen. Then the attackers changed their tactics. 2 of them began laying down a heavy, concentrated fire on the front of the cabin, forcing Luke and Raoul to keep their heads down. The 3rd man, Mary Ellen realized with a surge of panic, had disappeared. "Luke," she cried, "there's one missing." But it was too late. A loud crash came from the back of the cabin as the small kitchen window was smashed in. Luke spun around, his revolver raised, just as one of Silas's thugs scrambled through the opening. The man was big and burly, and he held a heavy, gnarled log in his hands like a club. Luke fired, but the man was already charging. The bullet caught the man in the arm, but his momentum carried him forward. He swung the log in a vicious arc. Luke tried to dodge, but the blow caught him high on the side of the head with a sickening thud. Luke collapsed without a sound, his tall, powerful frame hitting the floor like a felled tree. The rifle slipped from his grasp and skidded across the room. "No!" Mary Ellen screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure horror. The front door burst open, kicked in from the outside. Silas stood there, a smoking pistol in his hand, a triumphant, demonic grin on his face. He saw Luke's unmoving form on the floor and laughed. Well, that's the end of that. His eyes swept the room and found Mary Ellen, cowering with Ben behind the hearth. His grin widened. "There you are, my pretty little runaway. Mr. Abernathy is very eager to see you." He took a step into the room, but his other man, the one with the wounded arm, pointed at Ben. "What about the boy?" he grunted. Silas's cold eyes flickered to Ben. "Insurance," he said. He moved with startling speed, crossing the room and grabbing Ben before Mary Ellen could even react. He yanked the boy to his feet, clamping a hand over his mouth and pressing the barrel of his pistol to the child's small head. "Ben!" Mary Ellen shrieked, scrambling forward. "Stay back," Silas snarled, dragging the whimpering, terrified boy toward the door. "One more step and I'll scatter his brains all over this floor. We're leaving. Raoul, you old goat. You fire one shot and the boy dies." Everything inside Mary Ellen went cold and still. The fear, the panic, the despair, it all vanished, burned away by a white-hot, protective rage that was purer and stronger than anything she had ever felt in her life. The terrified girl who had run from Ohio, who had hidden under a coat on a train, was gone. In her place stood something new, something forged in the fire of that terrible moment. Her eyes fell on the Winchester rifle lying on the floor near Luke's still form. While Silas was backing out the door, using Ben as a shield, she moved. She scrambled across the floor, grabbed the heavy rifle, and rose to her feet. The weapon felt impossibly heavy, its stock awkward and clumsy against her shoulder. She followed them out onto the porch. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of Ben's muffled sobs and Silas's harsh breathing unnaturally loud. Raoul was by the trough, his shotgun raised but his face a mask of helpless fury, unable to risk a shot. "Put the gun down, girl," Silas sneered. Seeing her, "You don't have the nerve." Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep the rifle level. The front sight wavered, dancing a frantic jig around Silas's dark form. He was right. She couldn't do it. She couldn't hold it steady. But then her gaze locked on Ben's face. His eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down his dust-streaked cheeks. And in that moment, she remembered Luke's words, spoken in what felt like another lifetime. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it." Her hands still shook, but her resolve became a column of unbendable steel. She wasn't aiming for his head. She wasn't aiming for his heart. She was aiming for the arm that held the pistol to Ben's temple. She took a ragged breath, held it, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with the force of a mule's kick, and the explosion was deafening. For a second, she thought she had missed. Then Silas screamed, a high, strangled cry of pain and shock. He staggered back, dropping his pistol. His right arm hung limp and useless at his side, a dark, spreading stain blooming on his shoulder. His grip on Ben loosened. It was the only opening they needed. "Now, Raoul!" she screamed. The old man's shotgun boomed, a deafening roar that sent a spray of buckshot into the dirt near the other thug's feet, making him dive for cover. Ben, freed, scrambled away from Silas and ran, sobbing, straight into Mary Ellen's arms. She dropped the rifle and fell to her knees, clutching the trembling boy to her chest, shielding him with her own body. Silas, clutching his ruined shoulder, cursed them, his face contorted in a mask of agony and hate. His men, seeing their leader wounded and their leverage gone, had no more fight in them. They grabbed Silas, hauled him onto his horse, and fled, disappearing back into the trees from which they had come, leaving a trail of dust and blood in their wake. The valley was suddenly, unnaturally silent. The battle was over. They had won. Ben was safe, sobbing into her shoulder. But as Mary Ellen held him, her own body shaking with the aftershock of what she had done, her eyes went to the open cabin door, to the place where Luke still lay, silent and unmoving, on the hard planked floor. For a long moment after the dust from the fleeing riders had settled, the world seemed to hold its breath. The valley, which had moments before been a cacophony of gunfire and shouting, was now unnervingly silent. The only sounds were the soft whisper of the wind through the shattered window pane and the ragged, hitching sobs of the small boy clinging to her. Mary Ellen knelt in the dirt of the yard, her arms a protective cage around Ben, her own body trembling in the violent aftershocks of the fight. She was alive. Ben was safe. The storm had passed. But the storm had left a wreck in its wake. Her gaze was pulled, as if by an invisible string, to the dark, open maw of the cabin doorway. Inside that doorway, in the shadows, lay the still, silent form of the man who was the heart of this small world. The man who was its walls, its roof, its shield. Raoul was the first to move. The old man lowered his shotgun, his face grim, his movements stiff with an old man's aches, now amplified by the tension of the fight. He came over to her, his wrinkled face a mask of concern. "They gone, miss," he said, his voice raspy. "For now." Mary Ellen looked up at him, her eyes wide and blank with shock. She could feel Ben's tears soaking the front of her dress. She had to be strong for him. She had to get him away from this. "Raoul," she said, her voice a cracked whisper. "Take Ben, please. Take him to the barn. Don't let him see." The old man nodded, his understanding immediate. He gently pried the boy from her arms. "Come on, son," he said, his voice softening. "Let's you and me go check on Dusty. I bet he's spooked." Ben, too exhausted and terrified to resist, allowed himself to be led away, his small, heartbroken sobs trailing behind him. The moment they were gone, the strength that had held Mary Ellen together shattered. She scrambled to her feet and ran into the cabin, her heart a frantic, panicked drum against her ribs. He lay where he had fallen. The sheer, shocking stillness of him was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. Luke Hart was a man of immense presence, of constant, controlled motion. To see him so utterly inert was a violation of the natural order of things. He was on his side, his long limbs sprawled at an unnatural angle, his face turned away from her. The heavy log the thug had used lay discarded nearby. "Luke," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch him, afraid of what she might find. A dark, ugly bruise was already purpling on his temple, and from a deep gash just above it, a slow, steady trickle of blood ran down, staining the rough floorboards a dark, sickening crimson. "Luke, please," she begged, the words catching in a sob. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his shoulder. His shirt was warm, but there was no response, no flicker of movement. She could feel the solid, powerful muscle beneath the fabric, but it was limp, without tension, without life. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. This couldn't be happening. Not him. He was the rock, the mountain. He couldn't fall. If he fell, the whole world fell with him. "Luke," she cried, her voice breaking, louder this time. She gently pushed on his shoulder, rolling him onto his back. His head lolled to the side, and his hat, which had somehow remained on his head, fell off, revealing his face completely for the first time. It was a strong face, all hard planes and sharp angles, carved by sun and wind and hardship. A thin white scar cut through one dark eyebrow. His jaw was firm, covered in dark stubble, but his eyes were closed, his face slack and pale beneath its tan. He looked younger than she had imagined, and terrifyingly vulnerable. The sight of him, so broken and helpless, shattered the last of her control. A great wrenching sob tore through her, a sound of utter desolation. The tears she had held back for so long through her flight, through the chase, through the terror of the attack finally came. They poured down her face in hot, unstoppable streams. She crawled closer, her hands fluttering uselessly around his wound. "Oh, no, no, please, no!" She wept, the words a desperate, nonsensical prayer. She ripped a strip of cloth from the hem of her already torn dress and pressed it gently to his temple, trying to staunch the bleeding. The blood soaked through it almost instantly, warm and sticky on her fingers. She leaned down, pressing her ear to his chest, to the spot over his heart, her own breath held tight in her throat. For a terrifying, eternal second, she heard nothing. Then, faint and slow, but steady, she heard it, thump, 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 the slow, powerful beat of his heart. A wave of relief so profound it was painful washed through her, leaving her weak and trembling. He was alive, but he was so still. "Luke," she whispered, her tears dripping onto his face. "Please wake up. Please, you have to wake up. Don't you leave me here. You can't leave us. Don't you dare leave me." It was a confession, torn from the deepest part of her. In that moment, kneeling in his blood on the floor of the home he had given her, she finally understood the truth. She was not just a refugee he had sheltered. He was not just a stranger who had shown her a moment's kindness. In the crucible of their shared flight and the quiet intimacy of the days that followed, a bond had been forged. He had become her anchor, her shield, her hope. Without him, she was just a frightened, hunted girl again, lost in a world that wanted to devour her. Raoul returned, his face grim. "He's a tough man, miss," the old man said, his voice a low rumble. But that was a bad blow. Together, they managed to move him. It was a struggle, even unconscious. Luke was a dead weight of solid muscle. They half lifted, half dragged him to his bunk and gently laid him down. Raoul brought a basin of water and clean cloths. He examined the wound with a practiced eye. "Can't tell how bad it is on the inside," he said, his voice heavy with worry. "All we can do is keep him quiet, keep the fever down if it comes, and pray." Raoul eventually had to leave to tend to the animals and the damage to the homestead, leaving Mary Ellen alone with Luke in the deepening shadows. The afternoon bled into a long, quiet evening. She sat in a chair she had pulled beside his bunk, a silent, unmoving sentinel. She bathed his face with cool water, her touch infinitely gentle. She held his large, calloused hand in her two smaller ones, as if she could pour her own strength, her own desperate will to live, into him through her touch. She watched the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. She listened to every breath he took, her own breathing unconsciously mimicking his. The cabin was filled with the ghosts of the afternoon's violence, the shattered window, the splintered door, the dark stain on the floor, but all of it faded into the background. Her entire world had shrunk to the space of this small bunk, to the still, silent man lying in it. Hours crawled by. The moon rose, its pale, silvery light slanting through the broken window, striping the floor. The night grew cold, and she pulled a blanket over him, tucking it carefully around his shoulders. She never took her eyes off him. She thought about the man who lay before her, a man of so few words. Yet his actions had spoken volumes. He had offered her the shelter of his coat, the protection of his presence, the sanctuary of his home. He had jumped from a moving train for her. He had fought for her. He had fallen for her. And she had never even heard him laugh. She didn't know the color of his eyes when he was happy. She didn't know what his dreams were. She knew nothing about him. And yet, she knew everything that mattered. She knew he was a good man. A man who protected the weak. A man who stood between the innocent and the darkness. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, when the world is at its most silent and hope is at its most fragile, he groaned. It was a low, rough sound, filled with pain, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Her head, which had been drooping with exhaustion, snapped up. Her heart leaped into her throat. She leaned forward, her hand tightening on his. "Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered. It was the faintest of movements, but it was a sign. A miracle. He groaned again, a little stronger this time, and his head moved restlessly on the pillow. He was fighting his way back, swimming up from the deep, dark water of unconsciousness. "It's all right," she soothed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You're safe. I'm here." Slowly, with an effort that seemed to take all the strength he possessed, he opened his eyes. They were not the clear, stormy gray she remembered. They were clouded with pain, unfocused, and confused. They roamed the dark ceiling of the cabin before finally, slowly, finding their way to her face. He stared at her for a long moment, his brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of who she was, of where he was. She saw the moment recognition dawned. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He swallowed, a pained, difficult motion. He tried again. "Ben," he rasped, his voice a dry, broken whisper, barely audible. "Safe." His first thought, his first words, not for himself, not for his pain, for the boy. And in that moment, something inside Mary Ellen shifted. A lock she didn't even know existed deep within her heart clicked open. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long, the fear of being caught, the fear of being alone, the fear of being helpless, was suddenly eclipsed by a new, powerful emotion. It was a fierce, protective certainty, a feeling as solid and real as the hard-packed earth beneath her feet. She brought his hand to her cheek, pressing it there, her tears finally falling again. But these were not tears of grief or terror. They were tears of profound, bone-deep relief, of an emotion so overwhelming she had no name for it. "Yes, Luke," she whispered, her voice choked but clear. "He's safe. Raoul has him. We're all safe because of you." A faint light of relief flickered in his clouded eyes. He closed them again, his body succumbing to the heavy pull of exhaustion and pain. But his breathing was deeper now. More even. He was still with her. He would get better. She watched him, her own body trembling. Not from fear, but from the sheer force of the revelation that had just washed over her. She looked around the battered cabin, at the signs of the violent struggle, at the man who had laid down his life to protect this small patch of ground. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very marrow of her bones, that she was done running. Her flight had not ended when she had jumped from the train. It had not ended when she'd reached the sanctuary of this valley. It ended now, in this dark, quiet room, at the side of this wounded man. This was not a temporary hiding place. This was not a stop along the way. It was home. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if Silas and his men would return. She didn't know if they could ever truly be safe. But it no longer mattered. She would not run from it. She would stand and face it. She would stand and fight, just as she had with the rifle in her hands. Because for the first time in her life, she had found something and someone worth fighting for. Her eyes, shining in the dim lamplight, were filled with a new, unwavering belief. The belief that she belonged right here. She wanted to stay. The wake of the storm was a landscape of quiet, aching work. The violent terror of the attack receded. replaced by the slow, demanding rhythm of healing and rebuilding. Luke's return to consciousness was not a sudden miracle, but the beginning of a long, arduous journey back from the brink. The first few days, he drifted in a gray, pain-filled fog, his moments of lucidity brief and far between. In those lucid moments, his eyes, clouded and dull, would find her. A flicker of recognition, a silent question. She would answer with a soft cloth dipped in cool water on his forehead, or a spoonful of thin, warm broth held to his lips. Mary Ellen's life found a new, singular purpose. She became the keeper of his flame, the guardian of his recovery. Her days were measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of his needs. She learned the geography of his pain from the tight clench of his jaw, the subtle furrow in his brow. She learned to move about the cabin with a soundless grace, her steps light on the floorboards so as not to disturb his fragile rest. Her world, which had once stretched across the vast, terrifying expanse of the American continent, had now shrunk to the size of this quiet, shadowed sick room. And yet, it felt fuller and more meaningful than it ever had before. She fed him, bathed him, and sat with him through the long, silent hours, her presence a constant, reassuring anchor in his sea of pain. She would talk to him sometimes, her voice a low, soothing murmur, telling him about her day, about the mundane, essential tasks that kept their small world turning. She told him how Ben had finally learned to gather the eggs without breaking any, how the corn in the garden was an inch taller, how a doe and her fawn had come to drink at the creek in the early morning light. She didn't know if he could hear her, or if the words even registered, but she spoke them anyway, weaving a tapestry of life and continuity to drape over the stillness of his bunk. With Luke incapacitated, the homestead's relentless demands did not cease. Life had to go on. And so, Mary Ellen, the girl who had known only the soft hands of a farmer's daughter in a gentle Ohio valley, began the transformation into a woman of the West. Raoul, with his quiet, bottomless well of practical knowledge, became her teacher. He showed her how to milk their single, cantankerous cow, his gnarled hands patiently guiding hers until her clumsy, ineffective squeezing became a steady, rhythmic pull. He taught her how to mend the section of the corral fence that had been splintered by a stray bullet, how to hold the hammer so it didn't sting her hand with every blow. She learned the feel of good soil, the difference between a weed and a struggling seedling. Her hands, which had been soft and pale, became chapped, then calloused, her fingernails permanently rimmed with the good, dark earth. She was tired every night, an ache in muscles she hadn't known she possessed, but it was a clean, satisfying exhaustion. It was the ache of a life being actively lived, not passively endured. But her most important work took place inside the cabin, at the rough-hewn table. Ben, who had been quiet and withdrawn since the attack, his young mind struggling to process the terror he had witnessed, began to emerge from his shell under her gentle tutelage. She found an old, tattered primer in the chest at the foot of Luke's bunk, its pages filled with simple words and faded illustrations. "We're going to learn to read," she announced one morning, her voice bright with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. And so their lessons began. Hour after hour, they would sit together, Ben's small, dark head bent close to her own, his small finger tracing the black letters on the page. At first, it was a struggle. The letters were just meaningless squiggles to him, but she was endlessly patient. She sounded out the words, her voice soft and encouraging. A is for apple, B is for boy, C is for cat. The day he finally read his first full word on his own son was a triumph. A slow, radiant smile spread across his face, a genuine, unclouded smile she hadn't seen since before the attack. He looked up at her, his brown eyes shining with pride. "Son," he repeated, the word a small, perfect miracle. She felt a surge of joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. In that moment, teaching this small, orphaned boy to unlock the mysteries of the written word felt like the most important thing she had ever done in her life. It was an act of profound hope, a defiance against the darkness that had tried to engulf them. It was a promise that there would be a future filled with learning and light. And from his bunk, Luke watched them. His periods of wakefulness were growing longer now. He would lie there, silent, his stormy gray eyes clear once more, and he would watch her. He watched her patient lessons with Ben. He watched her moving about the cabin, her brow furrowed in concentration as she kneaded dough for their daily bread. He watched her in the evenings, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp as she mended his shirts, her stitches small and neat. He began to watch her in a way he never had before. It was a look of quiet, intense contemplation, a gaze that seemed to take in every detail of her being the stray strands of hay-colored hair that escaped her bun, the determined set of her jaw as she wrestled with a stubborn task, the way her face softened when she smiled at Ben. It was a look that held a deep, unspoken gratitude, but there was something more in it, too, a kind of wonder, a dawning reverence. Their conversation remained one of unspoken gestures, but its vocabulary was growing richer, its syntax more complex. When he was finally strong enough to sit at the table with them for meals, he took the ladle from her hand and served the stew himself, and he filled her bowl first. It was a small thing, a simple act of frontier chivalry, but in the quiet context of their lives, it was a declaration. It was a gesture of honor, of respect. It was his way of acknowledging that she was no longer just a refugee under his protection. She was the mistress of his home. She, in turn, learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the minute changes in his posture. She knew when his head was aching from the slight tightening around his eyes. She knew when he was growing frustrated with his own weakness from the way he clenched his fists. And she learned how to soothe him, not with fussing or coddling, which he would have hated, but with a quiet, steady presence, a cup of hot broth, or a simple, reassuring touch on his arm. Their hands would brush as she passed him a plate. Their shoulders would touch as they worked side by side. These small, fleeting points of contact were electric, charged with all the things they could not, or would not, say. One afternoon, Ben managed to trap a small frog by the creek and, in his excitement, brought it into the cabin to show them. As it often does, the frog made a desperate leap for freedom, landing squarely in the middle of Mary Ellen's mending basket. She let out a small shriek of surprise, followed by a peal of helpless, genuine laughter as the frog, tangled in thread, made another comical leap. It was the first time Luke had heard her truly laugh, not a small, polite smile, but a full, free, joyous sound that filled the small cabin with light. He had just managed to walk, unsteadily, to his chair by the hearth. He stopped, leaning against the mantel for support, and he simply watched her, a slow, almost imperceptible smile touching his own lips. The sound of her laughter was the sound of life returning, the sound of the shadow finally lifting from his home, and in that moment, he knew that he never wanted that sound to leave. The days continued to pass, turning into weeks. The shattered window was repaired. The splintered door was reinforced. Luke's strength slowly returned. He began to walk around the yard, then to the barn. He was still not the man he had been, but the unbreachable strength was returning to his core, the confidence to his stride. But something had fundamentally changed. A new, invisible architecture had been built between them, a structure of mutual reliance and unspoken affection. Love had not been invited in. It had simply taken root in the fertile ground of their shared ordeal, spreading like a quiet, underground spring. Its presence felt not in grand declarations, but in the 1,000 tiny details of their life together. It was in the way she saved him the last of the coffee. It was in the way he would look up from his work just to watch her walk across the yard. It was in the comfortable silence that now settled between them in the evenings. A silence that was no longer empty, but full of a deep and abiding connection, a love that had no need for a name. The seasons began to turn, the relentless heat of summer giving way to the crisp, golden afternoons of a high desert autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, but inside the small log cabin, a steady warmth had taken root, a warmth that had little to do with the fire in the hearth. The scars on their lives, like the scars on the land, were beginning to fade, not vanishing completely, but softening into the landscape of their new reality. The splintered door had been replaced with a sturdier one, built by Luke and Raoul's hands, a new pane of glass, brought by Raoul from a trading post a day's ride away, sat snugly in the kitchen window. The dark stain on the floor where Luke had fallen had been scrubbed and sanded away until it was only a faint, ghostly memory. These were the last vestiges of the storm, small reminders of the crucible that had forged them into something new, something that felt impossibly like a family. Luke was whole again. His strength had returned, and with it, the quiet, confident grace of his movements. But he was a different man. The hard, solitary shell he had worn like a suit of armor had been cracked open. A quiet gentleness now lived in his eyes when he looked at Mary Ellen, a soft patience in his hands when he showed Ben how to properly hold a whittling knife. He still spoke little, but his silences were different now. No longer the guarded quiet of a man alone with his ghosts, but the comfortable, companionable silence of a man at peace in his own home. And Mary Ellen had bloomed. The haunted, terrified girl who had stumbled into this valley was gone. In her place was a woman, her hands strong and capable, her face lightly tanned by the sun, her eyes clear and steady. The valley had become her whole world, and she had embraced it, learned its rhythms, its hardships, and its fierce, wild beauty. She knew the best places to find wild onions, the way the wind sounded just before a rain, the precise moment the bread was done from its scent alone. And she had found her laugh again. It was a sound that came easily now, most often brought on by Ben, who was a whirlwind of boyish energy and endless curiosity. His lessons had progressed from the primer to an old, leather-bound copy of Robinson Crusoe, and his nightly readings by the fire, his small voice stumbling but determined, were the highlight of their day. He was a happy child, his past hurts soothed by the unwavering balm of their steady, quiet affection. The dark shadows that had haunted his eyes after the attack had vanished, replaced by the bright, clear light of a boy who knew he was safe, who knew he was loved. One evening, as the sun began its slow, majestic descent, they stood together on the small porch of the cabin. The sky was a breathtaking spectacle of color, the western horizon painted in strokes of deep magenta, burnt orange and soft, dusty rose. The air was still and cool, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine from the high country. Below them, in the yard, Ben was chasing fireflies, his small form a darting silhouette against the deepening twilight, his laughter echoing softly in the quiet air. It was a moment of perfect, unblemished peace. Mary Ellen leaned against the porch rail, a half-mended shirt of Ben's forgotten in her lap. She watched the boy, a soft, unconscious smile on her face. She felt Luke come to stand beside her, his presence a familiar, comforting warmth. He didn't touch her, but she was as aware of him as if he had his arm around her. They stood in their usual comfortable silence for a long time, watching the boy, listening to the evening sounds of the valley settling in for the night. The peace was so deep, so profound, it was almost frightening, and it was this thought that gave voice to the last, lingering shadow in her heart. She turned her head to look at the vast, darkening landscape beyond their small, protected circle of light. "I'm still scared," she said, her voice a near whisper, not meant to break the spell of the evening, but to simply give name to a truth. Luke did not seem surprised. He was silent for a moment, and she thought perhaps he hadn't heard her. Then he turned his head and looked down at her, in the soft, fading light. His face was all shadow and plains, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze, his big, rough hand, The hand that had pulled her from a train and taught her how to hold a rifle came to cover hers where it rested on the porch rail. His touch was gentle, his calloused skin warm against her own. "Good," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "So am I." The simple, honest words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. He, Luke Hart, the man who was as solid and fearless as the mountains that surrounded them, was admitting to fear. He wasn't dismissing hers. He wasn't placating her. He was meeting her in that vulnerable space and sharing it with her. She understood, then, that his fear was the same as hers. It wasn't the fear of Silas or Mr. Abernathy. It was the fear of losing this quiet evening, the sound of a small boy's laughter, the feel of her hand under his. He was scared because, for the first time in a long time, he had something precious, something vital, to lose. His fear was the truest measure of his love. It was the most profound declaration he could ever have made. A tear she didn't know was there welled and slipped down her cheek. He saw it glitter in the twilight and lifted his other hand, his thumb gently, almost clumsily, brushing it away. His touch was hesitant, as if he were handling something infinitely fragile. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his stormy eyes, she saw it all. The pain of his past, the solitude of his life, and the quiet, fierce, and absolute devotion he now felt for her and for the boy. There were no promises of a future free of hardship, no flowery vows of eternal love. There didn't need to be. His hand tightened on hers, a gentle, reassuring pressure. It was not a promise. It was an oath that whatever came, whatever storms the future held, they would face them together. He gave a slight nod toward the valley floor, where the last light of the sunset was turning the fields of wildflowers to a deep, bruised purple. He didn't speak, but she understood the invitation. She left the mending on the chair and allowed him to lead her down the steps of the porch. They walked away from the cabin, away from its protective walls, and out into the open. Ben, seeing them, let the fireflies go and ran to join them, his small hand finding and taking Mary Ellen's other one. They walked together, the three of them, into the vast, beautiful, and uncertain twilight. The tall shapes of the saguaros stood like ancient, silent witnesses. The air was cool on their faces. The wildflowers, the same kind she had once pressed into his book, bloomed all around them, their scent sweet in the evening air. They were not running from a dark past. They were walking, together, toward a shared horizon. No one was hiding anymore. No one was hunted. No one was alone. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also consider hitting the hype button to show your support.